the lack of capacity, I think, is actually becoming number one bottleneck for many developing countries to attract green money. Very few developing countries have bankable projects. They ask for money, but when money goes there, the money decide to leave.
Hi, my name is David Sandalow. I'm the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University and a board member at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. And today I'm delighted to be welcoming my friend and colleague Ma Jun, who's chairman of the Green Finance Committee at the China Society for Finance and Banking and founder of the Institute of Finance and Sustainability, for a conversation on climate, finance, clean energy topics. Been looking forward to this for a while. I'll just apologize to our listeners and viewers up front. I seem to have lost my voice the past 24 hours, so I hope my voice holds up for our conversation. But we've been working together, Ma Jun and I, along with several dozen colleagues, on a Track 2 dialogue sponsored by the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. We've had 3 meetings over the course of the past couple of years, and may have a meeting. We hope to have a meeting later this year. So there's lots to discuss, and so let me just start by welcoming you, Ma Jun. You're in the United States today. Welcome. Glad you're here.
Thank you, David, for hosting this conversation, and good to see you again.
It's great to see you. And let's start with what's happening in China today. Then we'll move to international and kind of diplomatic topics. But I've been reading some pretty striking statistics about the amount of clean energy deployment in China. Just maybe share with our viewers and listeners what's happening in China with kind of clean energy and climate change policy overall.
Yeah, you are the energy guy. I'm the finance guy. So probably I'll start with green finance, climate finance, which is so related to energy. In the last few years, we were seeing very rapid growth of Chinese green finance. Just take the green loans as the example. I think 2 years ago, the green loans in China were growing at about 30%. And the last year, 2024, it's been growing at 22%. Still very strong off the very high base. And a large part of the green financing is going to renewable energy, storage, hydrogen, and so on and so forth. So that really indicates sort of the pace of growth in green energy sector that's several times higher than the national economy. And now back to a couple of energy-related numbers. I think the recent reported figure was the Chinese renewable power capacity installation is already 50% of the total, meaning it exceeded coal-fired power generation in terms of capacity. Of course, in terms of production, it's still smaller. And the EV industry is now seeing 50% penetration ratio, meaning out of 100 cars that's sold in China, 50 of these cars are electric vehicles. And in comparison, I think the OECD countries are somewhere between 10 to 20%, and other developing countries are like 1 to 3% in terms of EV penetration. And batteries certainly, powering the energy system, and electric vehicles are growing very rapidly. I saw a number showing that in Shenzhen, it's just one city, they had 7,000 companies working on batteries. And hydrogen, another big deal. In recent days, I attended a conference hosted in Hong Kong for the Chinese hydrogen companies, and it gathered 700 people to that just a conference on one subject, which is hydrogen.
There's a lot happening, and in my last trip to China, I was really struck at how many green license plates I saw on the roads of Beijing and Shanghai, where I had a chance to visit. And to our viewers and listeners who have been to China, you're probably familiar with the fact that green license plates are the plug-in electric vehicles, and blue license plates are the conventional vehicles, I think. And they're green license plates in abundance on the highways of Beijing and Shanghai in my last trip. A question.
That's a policy. I think it's a very inexpensive policy from government perspective to promote the EV, because it doesn't really ask the government to pay for it, right? It's just arranging this favorable licensing policy for EV holders. You can very quickly shift the consumption from the fossil fuel towards the EVs.
Just one follow-up question on the green finance, Ma Jun. What counts as green finance and a green loan in China? There've been, I know, discussions about taxonomy over the years. What counts today?
Yeah, that was a very old topic in China. You know, I started working on green finance policy in 2014 in China. At that time, we began to define what green activities are for financing. And at that time, we had the green finance definition in the form of taxonomy for the loans and the taxonomy for the green bonds. Initially, it was a few page list of items, and now it's like a 600 page, 600, I'm sorry, 60 page document listing all these green items, for example, solar, wind, biomass, electric vehicles, batteries, solid waste treatment, water treatment, and so on. So it's listed in the big table, which we call taxonomy. And then the banks will basically check the project information against the table. If it's in line, then they label this as a green loan or green bond. Of course, it's not that simple. It requires a lot of data reporting, disclosure, and third-party verification when needed. And this is what I call ecosystem with taxonomy, with verification, with disclosure to prevent greenwashing against the green loan labeling.
Terrific. Well, let's go to the international context. And of course, there's been a big change in the United States with the change of administrations from the Biden administration to the Trump administration on climate policy overall. The President Trump, has called climate change a hoax, and I recently heard a speech by one of his cabinet secretaries who took a slightly different view. He said he accepts that greenhouse gases are increasing in the atmosphere and that they're causing climate change, but in his view, it's just it's not a priority problem. I wonder, does this change in U.S. government policy, kind of a first question, do you think this will affect Chinese domestic policy in any way?
I don't think affect Chinese policy on carbon neutrality, energy in any significant way, but it does affect our ability to export green goods to the U.S. For example, U.S. put up this 100% tariff on Chinese EV, and now putting restrictions on battery, including especially on China-made battery, and also setting up some barriers on Chinese exports through other countries. I think if you produce it in Mexico or ASEAN countries, you're also facing problems from the U.S. policy. So that has an impact, which is limiting the Chinese market for Chinese products. And that's why China is now seeking, much more aggressively promoting its business, whether it's exports or its investment in the global south. And I just held a conference back a few days ago in Hong Kong. We invited 100 Chinese entrepreneurs in the green industry. They're all looking for chance to go out, especially in ASEAN countries.
Maybe just say another word about that. How do you think that's going? You think these exports are going to grow quickly to other global South countries?
I think theoretically, these Chinese green goods, for example, solar, wind equipment, electric vehicles, batteries, and so on, they're very competitive in terms of good quality and very cheap prices, and they should go everywhere, right? But the problem is that the U.S. has emphasis is national security and bringing job back, and Europe is also concerned about their own EV companies being challenged by Chinese goods and so on. But in the rest of the world, especially global south, there's much less of that kind of competition. And simply the very, very little manufacturing capability of such goods. In that sense, they generally welcome Chinese products because Chinese products, compared with similar products from elsewhere, is cheaper. And just to give you an example, I was in Timor-Leste, which is a small island country. It used to be part of Indonesia. And when I was there 4 or 5 months ago, I saw their power was selling at 24 US cents per kilowatt. And we were telling them China was able to do a solar power project in nearby places with 3 or 4 cents US dollar. So that kind of capacity and cost, I think, is hugely competitive and very welcome in many of the global south countries.
Imagine, would that 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour, would that be a coal-fired power plant, or would that be a solar plant, or what type of technology would deliver that?
Now, overseas investment, as the country stated back a few years ago, China has stopped all investments in other countries in the coal-fired power generation sector, which means that all new energy projects will have to be renewable. That's right. Indeed, lots of solar, wind, biomass projects invested by Chinese in certain countries.
And how about exports to Europe? Any trends happening there that you can comment on?
I think Europe was putting up like a 25-30% tariff on Chinese EVs, and they were telling me this is really protecting their own industry, right? Compared with the Chinese very cheap products. And I think Chinese are now sort of renegotiating with the Europe counterparts on, possibly cutting back on the tariff. And if China can, for example, put some self-restraint on the quantity of exports, and also China can promise to invest in Europe on production capacity to make the products locally. I think this kind of negotiation may end up with some, softening of position on both sides.
Well, you've been such a leader on climate finance for more than a decade, and any thoughts about trends in kind of the multilateral diplomacy on climate finance? I think there was some convergence on taxonomy issues, I think, a few years ago. And how do you see these issues going right now?
Now, on the global level, as you know, I've been co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group for many years. And during that period, we had discussions on driving convergence on global sustainable finance taxonomy, which means that let's define green activities in a similar way. And let's converge the reporting standards, which is now leading to the application of ISSB for many countries. And let's develop some principles for key products, such as transition finance products. So we've done lots of these already under the G20 framework and also other platforms, such as the European Chinese-led Common Ground Taxonomy Working Group. Specifically on the taxonomy side, the Common Ground Taxonomy, which is a joint product between China and Europe, produced this version of taxonomy, which is now being used by cross-border green capital flows. For example, the Chinese issuing green bonds internationally, they put a sticker on the CGT-aligned sticker, then they can sell to Europe, rather than putting multiple stickers and having many different verifications against different standards. So this facilitates cross-border transaction. And on this exercise, last year, Singapore joined, saying, hey, we want to join your China-European led work on common ground taxonomy. Let's make it a multi-jurisdiction common ground taxonomy. So end of last year, we published this MCGT, which was a joint product of Europe, China, and Singapore. We jointly defined a set of activities as green finance supported activities. In the future, this MCG could be used to label many more finance products, for example, green bonds, green funds, and so on, to facilitate the capital flows between different jurisdictions. The other example is the ISSB, which originally was TCFD, and U.S. made a lot of contribution to that. And I worked with Mary Shapiro promoting that in other parts of the world. And later on, it became the ISSB. And ISSB is now being adopted in many, many jurisdictions, including by China. The Ministry of Finance of China has published a version of domestic disclosure requirements based on ISSB. Of course, that's only S1 for now, which is a framework. And they're now working on S2, which is climate-related disclosure requirements in China. So I think this is another major progress on the sustainable finance space to harmonize reporting standard, which will lower cost for a lot of investors, especially those to make cross-border investments. And just give you one more example on transition finance framework. That's a new topic, relatively new. And 2022, we put it out as a G20 framework. And now it's guiding a lot of countries in drafting their domestic guidance standards for transition finance. Without such international coordination, we end up with too many very different versions of product guidelines, and eventually very hard to consolidate. So the role of international platform like G20 is indeed providing the international public goods that's needed to reduce the cost of moving towards a more integrated global green finance market.
That's a lot of activity. That's striking. And a follow-up question on the disclosure requirements in China that you mentioned, because I think that'll be of interest to a number of our listeners. Do those apply to kind of all Chinese companies, or or what's the scope of this?
Now, the MOF or Minister of Finance version is applying to all companies. And after that, which is sort of the framework document, we're going to see more ministries putting out disclosure requirements on entities they regulate. For example, the People's Bank of China, which is central bank, is working on ISSP aligned disclosure requirements for the banks. And the Securities Commission, under which there are a couple of stock exchanges, are working on ESG reporting requirements for listed companies. So each of them will adopt some ISSP elements in line with the MOF version. But the more aggressive one is actually in Hong Kong. You know, Hong Kong being a special administrative region in China, they have adopted a mandatory version of ISSP starting from beginning of this year. And you know, Hong Kong hosts a lot of listed companies from mainland China, and about 70% of market cap in Hong Kong are actually Chinese companies. So in that sense, part of China is already using ISSP on a mandatory basis starting from this year because of Hong Kong regulation.
There's been a dialogue on climate finance under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's been pretty high profile. And I wonder, are you following that dialogue at all? And what impact do you think that has?
Now, everybody is talking about this NDC negotiation, which should happen this year, but looks like most countries missed the deadline, which was set, I think, in February. But they are all agreeing to do something later this year. I think the new deadline is September for all countries that haven't submitted the new NDC to do so. So we're looking forward to that to be sort of consolidated by end of this year, the COP.
Well, you know, we could keep talking for a long time, and let's just close by a few thoughts about our track to dialogue. That it's been my privilege to share this with you over the course of the past couple of years, and it's kind of a first question. I wonder, do you and your colleagues find these track two dialogues to be helpful, and if so, and kind of why and in what way?
Well, definitely. Now I have a feeling from the China side that they're all very eager to participate, whether it's you know, former policymakers and policy advisors, or corporates and financial institutions. You know, for the real business guy, they want to look for opportunities for making money, right? By you know, finding you know, partners in the U.S. and exploring business opportunity for us, you know, to work on really policy initiative that can improve the bilateral relationship, especially on the climate side and finance side. Now, in terms of the outcome we produced last year, you know, both of us co-chaired the dialogue in September last year that took place in New York. I think we had three sets of recommendations. One is on the bilateral level, namely between China and US, let's do something. And at that time, one of the hopeful result is to create a wide list, meaning a list of activities that both countries would agree to encourage collaboration, you know, maybe by private sector, by financial firms and so on, but the government would not block them, right, would not sanction them. And at that time, I thought a list could be fairly long, but looks like the list is getting narrower and narrower, especially you know, given the latest Trump administration's position, especially on the recent issuance of the American First investment policy, which is, I think, making this white list even more difficult. But still, some of my colleagues are saying, let's find a couple of items which are less sort of sensitive. They're not related to defense. They're all for civilian usage. For example, plastic recycling, full waste recycling, energy saving for buildings, and so on and so forth. I think these might still be possible, but unlikely to be a government-to-government agreement. I don't think the national governments, you know, federal government in the US and national government in China will be talking to each other on that. But still, I think it's possible for the subnational governments, maybe California versus Guangdong, to talk about something like that, and maybe private sector, you know, to discuss options on collaboration in these areas. This is really about bilateral investment, trade, and technology cooperation. But we can also engage in sort of a less money-intensive activities, for example, scholarly exchange and students exchange. NGO, dialogue to disseminate, best practices and engaging, discussions on how to contribute to the global agenda and so on. The second big topic, we ended up with some recommendation is on third countries, how China, US can help emerging markets, developing country in general. And there are lots of options. For example, let's do a guarantee facility to support private sector financing for green projects in certain markets. Let's do a technical sort of a support platform, which will enable developing countries to access green technology from China, US, and elsewhere. And let's do training. For example, the Capacity Building Alliance of Sustainable Investment, which I started 1.5 years ago, now with 70 organizations, including yours. We're doing a lot of training already. Last year, we trained 5,000 green finance specialists from the Global South, and we can continue to expand that kind of collaboration. At the global level, I think even without government involvements, the private sector knowledge, expertise in the US can be sufficient to contribute to a lot of a global dialogue on, for example, carbon accounting standards, disclosure, on connectivity of voluntary carbon markets and so on. I think these things should still continue.
I'm glad you mentioned your training platform. It's CASI, I think, is the acronym, right? And maybe just share with people, more information about that, because I think it's such a good program, and I think people are very interested in that.
Yeah, this program is called CASI for short, but the full name is called Capacity Building Alliance of Sustainable Investment. The idea really came when I was still co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. At that time, we're talking about mainly funding developing country. But when you go into these countries, you'll find that very few developing countries have bankable projects. They ask for money, but when money goes there, the money decide to leave because these projects are not bankable, meaning I won't get money back, principal and interest, due to the lack of capacity to design these projects. Of course, there are a lot of policy issues as well. The government have to, put in place the policy environment, the certainty, on implementing the contracts, and the green finance instruments domestically that can offer some local financing for green projects and so on. So the lack of capacity, I think, is actually becoming #1 bottleneck for many developing countries to attract green money, whether it's international or domestic. So with that view, we proposed at the end of 2023 to launch this global coalition for capacity building for developing countries. That's called CASI. And at that time, it was 40-something organizations joined when we launched at the COP28 2023. And throughout last year, we began to implement the CASI program. We offered major face-to-face training programs in 5 places, including Brazil, in Hong Kong, in Huzhou, in Doha, in Azerbaijan. And this year, we're continuing all these big sort of forums. And I'm going to South Africa just right after this trip to the US. And we'll be doing this in Malaysia. We'll be doing this in Brazil again this year, and also in Hong Kong. So every year, we will train few thousand people from these face-to-face learning, plus the online webinar. But the more exciting program we launched under CASI is these online courses. And as of the end of this month, we're going to have 30 modules available, 30 hours of contents on all kinds of topics under sustainable finance. And by end of next year, we're aiming to put out 100 modules on different aspects of sustainable finance. So really looking forward to more collaboration with different organizations, including university, NGO, banks, and so on, to disseminate knowledge more effectively to the wider global south.
Well, it's a very impressive program. Well, last question. We are hoping to hold another meeting of our Track 2 dialogue this year. And I wonder any initial thoughts on what we should be discussing and what would be most helpful.
I think still along the line of the list of actions we proposed last year, but we need to be more realistic, right? Given that the US is withdrawing from Paris Agreement and withdrawing from lots of international networks such as NGFS and so on. So at the federal level, very little we can do, but we should focus more on regional, subnational level on what NGOs, universities, and private companies can do, and especially on Global South. I think this is where the willing contributors can still do a lot for the climate agenda.
Well, I quite agree, and I'm glad you're focused. You mentioned as well the scholarly and the student exchanges. I think that's really important, and continuing those exchanges between our two countries is going to be really important for building the future of the relationship between our two countries. Ma Jun, thanks so much for your time. It's always great to see you. Great working together. I want to thank as well the staff of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. They do a lot of tremendous work behind the scenes. Thanks to everyone who helped pull this together. Thanks to everyone who listened and watched. And I look forward. Please look for more of these National Committee videos. And thanks everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you, David, and thank you, National Committee, for hosting us today.